Gamergate was a tide-turning event that I had the privilege and the misfortune of living through. Because I was a teenager at the time, I was unfortunately conscious enough to understand every single thing that happened. I am a well-adjusted individual who looks for facts and proof beyond all else, and because of this, I was on the opposing side of Gamergate. If you were unreasonable, hated women, an incel, or a godforsaken, lonely husk of a man, you were likely a part of, if not still are, on the side of the Gators. Gamergate was a radicalizing event for many young boys and men who had just become interested in politics for the very first time. It showed us that so long as you had a good cover story, see ethics in gaming, you could harass and hate women as much as you want without consequence. But I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Before we tackle how Gamergate was a main proponent of the Trump election being successful, I have to teach you about it. So let's keep this as simple as possible. In 2013, Zoe Quinn released the game Depression Quest for free or pay what you want. The fact that Quinn released a game was more than enough reason for their ex-boyfriend and passionate misogynist Eran Yorny to ruin Zoe's life. Please note that nowadays Quinn identifies as non-binary, so when I refer to their experience as misogyny, I want it to be clear that at the time it was. However, their identity would likely not have been respected and probably would have been ignored anyway. In August of 2014, Joni wrote the Zoe post, which accused Zoe of being a bad partner and cheating on Yorny. Side note, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, and I'm not giving him the respect of doing it properly anyway. This post would be deleted off Penny Arcade and the Something Awful boards, but found widespread success on 4chan. This post had later been edited by Joni as time went on, and he would then debunk his own original claims in confusing mixed statements and edits of the post. One of the main claims was that Zoe slept with game journalist Nathan Grayson for a good review of Depression Quest. This was the basis of Gamergate's facade of being obsessed with ethics in gaming. This was the catalytic event that was the downfall of ethical gaming. Quinn slept with Grayson for a good review, so that means that all women are evil temptresses who sleep around for good reviews of their games. Open and closed event that definitely happened. Except Nathan never reviewed Depression Quest. The basis of this entire movement was bullshit from the very beginning. Public IRC logs of the event would show that the movement was aware of this and didn't really care. 4chan posts revealed the harassers were only interested in attacking and harassing women in gaming. After the Zoe post went viral and IRCs were made, the harassment campaigns began. I won't go into too much detail because if I described every single act of harassment, we would be here for hours, but it was bad. Death threats, rape threats, mass shooting threats, bomb threats, doxing, threats against family, having to flee their home a second time, concerning phone calls. All of this for a false narrative invented by a man who was a little piss baby about his ex releasing a minorly successful game. Many false claims were being thrown around at this point, with absolutely no substantial evidence, and most of which being debunked by its own proponents. This is the muddy and confusing part that nobody really wants to research about Gamergate because, it's hard. It's hard to read through dozens of IRC logs to find the truth, and this is why it was so easy to trick people into falling for Gamergate. What's easier, reading through all of these logs and finding the fallacies and contradictions yourself, or taking some schmuck's word for it and chalking it all up to an issue with ethics in gaming? Some tomfoolery happened, and now we are at the point where any woman in game journalism was a target. SJWs, or rather anybody who cared about women and minorities, were also a target. Harassment campaign after harassment campaign would be launched at anybody who looked at Gamergate funny. This is when Anita Sarkeesian comes in. Anita was notable for talking about women in video games, which made her the perfect target for their next harassment campaign of Gamergate. She had previously made videos about women and game tropes before and had planned to continue doing so despite the harassment. Because of this, 4chan began to ramp up the threats that resulted in her speaking events being canceled due to bomb threats and mass shooting threats. This vicious cycle continues until the movement eventually begins to fizzle out in around 2016. Quinn and some others had actually managed to leak some of the chats in which the Gators had been admitting to lying and just doing this in order to ruin the lives of women, and the movement lost public eye. And this is where I end my brief summary of Gamergate. So what does this have to do with the alt-right or even Trump? Let's finally get into it. So at the end of 2016, you had this huge group of radicalized, lost, lonely men and boys who had just gotten a taste of politics. They're fired up, they're angry, they hate women and minorities, and they want something more to be angry over. This is around the time where triggered SJWs and feminist videos began going viral, with some close to 7 million views. Triggered SJW videos would lead to more, which would lead to Fox News platforming those videos, which would lead to recommended Fox News segments, which would lead to these boys finding more and more reactionary content. They couldn't even Google to find out that their whole movement was a smear campaign for no reason. Do you see where I'm going with this? Let's get some more context. 5 scientists set out to study the common theory that YouTube funnels people into the alt-right pipeline. Over 26% of people who commented on alt-right or these edgy cringe compilation type videos would later comment on in support of more alt-right ideologies. They found that the algorithm would often push users who watched these kinds of videos into more violent and reactionary extreme content. YouTube disagrees with this, however, they offered no substantial claims or counter studies or research to disprove the 5 researchers who came up with this theory in the first place. Here's where I want to take a look at the Google Trends at the time. So you can see here that terms like cringe comp, triggered feminist, triggered SJW, these type of alt-right topics all peaked in July of 2016. These sorts of topics, as proved by the research, would funnel people into more and more radicalizing topics. YouTube's main goal is to keep you on the site for as long as possible, which means the more it ramps up these search topics, the more interested you get and the longer you stayed to watch. This was especially true with the triggered comps, or what we would now refer to as cringe compilations. So let's put it in simpler terms. Boys who heard about Gamergate would go on YouTube to find videos on the topic. These videos would then be followed by triggered feminists, anti-SJW debates, owned compilations. And then, because YouTube needs your attention, they would have to ramp up the content. So that's how you get to videos about men's rights activists and feminist denouncers. But then we have to keep ramping it up. They have to keep your engagement. So now we're at Holocaust deniers and anti-Semitism, and now we're heading towards eugenics and replacement theories. All while a young boy was just here for cringe compilations. Fox News segments and Tucker Carlson interviews would be in the mix, which would then get these boys ready for their first election. These fine young martyrs of misogyny would then hear their same sentiments and opinions echoed by a brand new presidential candidate, Donald Trump. Repetition without proof is key in indoctrination, and Trump was the powerhouse of unverified claims and repetition. See, this is exactly at the time when many of these young boys were becoming of voting age. To quote Vox, still, Gamergate was arguably a watershed moment and learning experience for many future Trump supporters. As a movement, it showed the trend towards systematized online harassment and increased ideological polarization that emerged in the latter half of the 2010s. Time for some anecdotes. So this is where I tell some personal stories that all echo the same sentiment. I knew about this guy who worked at GameStop. He was actually a friend of mine. We weren't super close, but I had him on Facebook and I saw his posts. So I knew a little bit about him, and I knew that at the time he was left-leaning. He always seemed to be a pretty normal dude who respected me and my friends every time we came into GameStop because that was the place where you used to get video games. However, as soon as Gamergate happened, he would begin to argue on feminism, claim it was a cancer, argue about the rights of minorities, and eventually had lost all of his friends from his hateful ideology. I asked some of you on TikTok to share your experiences to see if anyone had a similar experience, and yeah, everyone had a story like this. This is all anecdotal, and I won't tell you to base your entire belief system off of a few stories. However, it seems that this thing happened reliably enough for a trend to occur, and I personally would love to be able to study this trend in some way. As a disclaimer, I am in no way stating that Gamergate invented the alt-right pipeline or was the beginning of radicalization. This has been happening for decades, and unfortunately, we likely won't ever escape it. I am, however, pointing out that this was a massive event that led to mass radicalization. Gamergate was simply a nasty symptom of a much larger and scarier illness. Many even theorize that Gamergate was so important that Trump would not have won without it. That's how polarizing this event was. So, do you think Trump would have won regardless of if Gamergate happened? Did you experience Gamergate, and what was your experience with it? Let me know in the comments below and give me some topics for future videos.